3 reasons why the Kansas City Chiefs still run the NFL. Subscribe and like the video if you do go on to enjoy. Let's hop into it. And we are going to begin with my very first reason why the Kansas City Chiefs still run the NFL, and that is that they had a pretty productive offseason. Now, I want to make one thing clear before we actually hop into their free agency and hop into their draft. I did not think this was a fantastic offseason, but as I mentioned, I thought it was a very productive offseason. They came into this offseason with a lot of question marks on this roster. What happens with Justin Reed, Trey Smith? What happens with Travis Kelce? What happens with a number of different pieces? And I thought for the most part, they did a fine job of keeping as many people as they could. This is what they did in free agency. This does not really mention who they lost, but I will bring up some names here in a moment. They signed tackle Jalen Moore to a 2-year deal, Christian Fulton to a 2-year deal, Elijah Mitchell, Gardner Minshew, and a handful of other guys. They also re-signed Nick Bolton, Marquise Brown, Charles Omenihu, and a handful of other more depth option guys. You can see they franchise tag Trey Smith. I'm sure they're going to work a long-term deal out soon. And because they prioritized bringing back Trey Smith, they had to move off of Joe Thuney. Now let's begin with what they gained in free agency, and then here in a moment, I'll talk about some of the losses and how those losses may impact their roster. Starting off with Jalen Moore, the tackle on a 2-year, $30 million deal. Obviously, this was not a tackle room last year in Kansas City that was particularly good. We all kind of know what happened in the Super Bowl when the Eagles were just able to tee off on Patrick Mahomes because the tackles in that offensive line were not very good at all. Not to mention, I think the guards and interior line kind of struggled a little bit in that one too. So in this offseason, it was pretty clear and obvious that they wanted to prioritize fixing up that tackle room, specifically that left tackle spot. Now, Jalen Moore's an interesting player because so far in his career, he's never really been a full-time starter. As you can see here via PFF, this past year, only 259 snaps. 2023, 226, 2022, 184, and 2021, only 90. So never a guy who's ever really been the full-time starter for San Francisco. But in those very small sample size of games that we have seen from him, I thought he's looked pretty darn good. Now, admittedly speaking, I do think it's a very risky contract. 2 years, $30 million to a guy who's never been a full-time starter is very questionable in my opinion. But I'm going to have some faith in Kansas City here that they kind of, I'm going to assume, know what they're doing. You don't just hand out $15 million a year to some bum who's just never going to start for you. I do think worst case scenario, Jalen Moore just ends up becoming your swing tackle or maybe your backup tackle. At the end of the day, tackles do get injured quite often, so having a really solid backup is always good. But I think best case scenario is that Jalen Moore ends up becoming a really good offensive lineman, and then you can move around Josh Simmons, who we'll talk about here in a minute, to maybe play right tackle or maybe even play guard. We'll just kind of have to wait and see. All in all, I'm not the biggest fan of this pickup, but I think it gets the job done if things do go the way of the Chiefs. Christian Fulton was also a very interesting pickup. He's had kind of a weird career where at times he looked like a future star, maybe not a star, but a really solid cornerback. And then at other times he's looked borderline unplayable. I thought last year for LA, he had a nice little resurgence for his career. As you can see via PFF last year, 71.1 overall grade, 79.3 run defense grade, 67.9 coverage grade. Stats look pretty good as well, only allowing 40 receptions last year. But as you can see in 2023, the numbers don't look as pretty. Same thing here in 2022, a 58.5 coverage grade. But you can see also in 2021, a 67.8, and 2020, a 56.5. So kind of an up and down career and kind of an up and down start to his career for Christian Fulton. I do think Kansas City is a team, though, that they get players in free agency and they instantly elevate their game with their personnel, with their coordinators, with their overall talent. I do think Christian Fulton will be in a really nice spot there. Right now, I would assume that he's going to play opposite of Trent McDuffie, but I'm also interested to see what happens with Jalen Watson as well as their 3rd round pick, which we'll talk about here in a minute. This is kind of a crowded cornerback room with a lot of really solid pieces. So it will be interesting to see who kind of fills in their roles and who becomes that second cornerback. Right now, I would assume it's Christian Fulton. Outside of that, Elijah Mitchell brings you a bit more speed. Gardner Minshew is a really solid backup quarterback, and I think he can get the job done. Veteran, he's been there, done that. I like that pickup. You re-signed Nick Bolton to a 3-year, $45 million deal. I think that's a really solid contract for somebody of his play. Trey Smith is still looking for a contract, and I'm sure he's going to get a contract done here soon. Unfortunately, because as I mentioned earlier, they prioritized Trey Smith, they had to move off of Joe Thuney, and that is going to sting because Joe Thuney is a really awesome player and was a kind of a cornerstone of this offensive line for the past few years. Getting off of him now kind of creates a hole at that left guard spot. I will say I do think they have a number of potential solutions to fill into that role if Joe Thuney's replacements in Caliendo and Kingsley don't end up working out. Outside of that, you did lose Tershawn Horton, who was one of your other pass rushers up the middle. I don't think that's going to be too big of a loss because you kind of replaced that guy in the draft. We'll talk about that here in a moment. And outside of that, yes, you lost Justin Reed, but you had a guy already kind of ready to go there. And for the most part, that was really like their biggest losses. Travis Kelce did return, and he's going to play for at least one more year with the Chiefs, so that's good news. I do think replacing him in the long term, though, should be something that this team at least tries to figure out this upcoming season. So that was it for their free agency. Obviously, they came into this offseason with not a ton of money to operate with and a lot of question marks as to who's staying and who's going. And I thought for the most part, they did the best job of maintaining as much talent as possible while not losing too much. But then we get into the 2025 NFL draft. With their first round pick, they took Josh Simmons. In round 2, Omar Norman-Lott. Round 3, Ashton Gillott. Round 3 again, Noah Williams, Jalen Royals, Jeffrey Bassa, and Brashard Smith. Now I'm going to go at this one by one. For some of these players, I'm not going to go into too much detail because a lot of these guys will just kind of end up being special teams and depth option pieces that don't impact the roster too much, but I'll give you kind of what I think they could end up becoming. Let's start off with Josh Simmons. Prior to that torn patella injury, he was somebody who had a lot of first round buzz to his name. And I'm not talking just, 31 overall. I'm talking top 15 buzz. And there's a lot of people who I respect very highly of who said if Josh Simmons did not have that torn patella injury, he would have been their tackle number 1 or tackle number 2 in this class. With that said, you cannot completely ignore the injury. A big part of Josh Simmons' game is that he is such an agile and quick mover for his size. And with this knee injury, you just kind of hope that it's not a big enough injury that hurts his play on the field. Because if it does, then I do have some question marks with Josh Simmons and what his game ultimately looks like with that injury. But the nice thing about this Chiefs situation is that he's not going to be forced to instantly become a contributor on this offense. Because you brought in Jalen Moore, because you already have a couple answers at guard, Josh Simmons can sit on the bench and fully recover until he's fully ready to go. And when he is fully ready to go, you just kind of have to rework your offensive line to find out where Josh Simmons fits. I do think Simmons is probably the long-term play at left tackle. I would not be surprised if they give him some reps at guard in the future because of just how questionable that guard situation is. Maybe long-term he also ends up playing right tackle, especially if Jalen Moore ends up working out at left tackle. Right now, the nice thing is because you drafted Josh Simmons and you also brought in Jalen Moore and Kingsley from last year who struggled a little bit but definitely has some talent, you now have a couple younger guys who give you some more options and variety on this offensive line. Last year, there was not that variety. There was not too many options, and they were really struggling on that unit last year. I think this unit this year, I wouldn't say it's better because Joe Thuney was so good for them at left guard, but I do think there's more options and more ways to work with this offensive line than there was last year. In general, I like the pickup. It is hopefully going to end up working out with this injury. I think it should. Then in round 2, Omar Norman-Lott. Now, Omar Norman-Lott was somebody who I really fell in love with the closer we got to the draft. Admittedly speaking, this is somebody that did not get a lot of playing time at Tennessee because they just rotated so many bodies on that defensive line. And it felt like in some ways Tennessee was a little bit scared to let Omar Norman-Lott play on certain downs and within certain packages. Like, this was a team that really did not want to have this guy out there on run defense, which makes me a little bit worried about what he looks like on that side of the offense. When the offense is pounding the rock over and over again, when you're going up against the Ravens or sometimes the Buffalo Bills, I kind of worry about that. But when you want to talk about somebody that gives you juice and gives you that pass rush element that I guess kind of Tershawn Horton gave to this team last year, Omar Norman-Lott can do just that. This guy is a straight up pass rushing demon. He made a lot of plays for Tennessee last year in what was not a lot of opportunities. This was a Chiefs team that really had a lot of question marks with that interior defensive line around Chris Jones. Bringing in Omar Norman-Lott, I don't think he's a 3-down guy, but I think if you want somebody who can come in on 3rd down, 2nd down, and long and create havoc up the middle alongside Chris Jones, I do think Omar Norman-Lott could be that guy. If you want to have a good defensive line, you need to have more variety off the bench. You need more depth. You need more variety. And I think that's exactly what Omar Norman-Lott does. Now I'm going to speed through some of these next ones because I don't really know what their roles are going to be. Ashton Gillott is a bigger edge rusher that has a lot of productivity, but I worry a little bit about his bend. Right now, I don't think he's ever going to be a full-time starter, but I could see him being a backup slash sort of a second wave of variety on the defensive line, especially in his first couple years. Maybe long-term, he could be your next guy next to George Karlaftis. We'll have to wait and see. Noah Williams is a really interesting pickup here. Right now, I think he probably fits in as that 3rd or 4th cornerback behind Christian Fulton, Jalen Watson, and of course McDuffie. But I think this is somebody who can provide depth early on, play special teams, and if he's able to beat out a guy like Jalen Watson, maybe you can see this guy end up moving into a bit more of a starting role. Jalen Royals is another one of these undersized wide receivers. This was, to me, the more questionable pick of the draft. Not because I don't like Jalen Royals, but this is a Chiefs offense that has so many undersized, speedy, crafty wide receivers. You have Xavier Worthy, Rashee Rice, Hollywood Brown, Sky Moore as well. I know Sky Moore hasn't worked out, but he's another one of those guys. Adding Jalen Royals to me is just kind of another one of those guys, and I did not like that pick. I would have much preferred, I don't know, like an Alec Ayomaner or somebody like that who gives them more of a size element, can win downfield a little bit. That's just not what Jalen Royals is going to do. Maybe he's their long-term replacement for Hollywood Brown, and maybe if Rashee Rice goes down big time because of that injury, maybe he can have a role there, but I don't know. I'm not expecting much from Jalen Royals with this roster. It's kind of a shame because I think he's a really good player. I just don't like his fit. Jeffrey Bassa is a really fast and agile linebacker, but it's going to be hard for him to get playing time with Leo Chanel, Drew Tranquil, and of course, Nick Bolton. So probably more of a special teams guy. Maybe could be one of their long-term plays at linebacker. I think he's got some talent, so I don't hate it there. And then round 7, Brashard Smith. A lot of people like this pick, and I'm definitely going to be somebody who backs this pick quite nicely here too. They had Isaiah Pacheco, they have Kareem Hunt, they have now Elijah Mitchell. They don't really have anybody young there though. Isaiah Pacheco, unfortunately, that leg injury is very scary, and we have to take that into account. Kareem Hunt is just not the mover at this stage of his career, so they really needed a young burst of energy. And as I mentioned earlier, we want to talk about variety, depth options that are different than the starters. That's exactly what Brashard Smith is. So all in all, I do think he'll have a role on this offense. It's just going to be interesting to see what packages he's used on. I could see him definitely being used as like a third down back, more involved in the screen game, you know, some design plays just for him. He's a very fast guy that could be quite twitchy. So I like the pickup. All in all, I like the draft quite a bit. I think there's a couple instant playmakers like Josh Simmons, Omar Norman-Lott. We'll see what guys like Noel, Jeffrey, Ashton, what all those guys can do in the future. But I like this draft. I thought it was a really solid haul. So all in all, I think this is an improved roster. I thought they did a nice job in this offseason, given all the circumstances that surrounded them. But let's go ahead and move on to reason number 2 why the Kansas City Chiefs are still the top team in the NFL, and they still run the NFL, is that they still have Patrick Mahomes and Andy Reid. Now, I know we all kind of talk about this when we talk about the Chiefs. As long as they have Reid, as long as they have Mahomes, they're going to be legit, but it's just kind of the truth. We just kind of gloss by that, but it just happens to be the exact reason why the Chiefs are one of the best teams in the NFL. Say what you want about Patrick Mahomes in the regular season. I will admit, statistically speaking, these past couple years, he hasn't necessarily been of the caliber of a Josh Allen, Lamar, or Burrow in the regular season. But regardless of his regular season play, which by no means is bad, he's still winning games, playing super clutch. You want to talk about a guy that is the most clutch player in the NFL, the best playoff performer in the NFL. And when it comes down to it, if I'm asking for a quarterback to win me a game on a fourth quarter, 1 minute drive or 2 minute drive, I'm picking Patrick Mahomes 10 times out of 10 because he's just the best at it. So Patrick Mahomes, as long as you have that guy, and as long as you're within striking distance late in the game, the Chiefs are probably going to win the game. And no, I don't think it's just because of the refs. I know so many people hate the Kansas City Chiefs, and it's kind of ironic because in the NBA, you have the OKC Thunder, and they want to call them foul merchants, and everyone wants to call Kansas City foul merchants. It's just not the case. When you're the best team in the NFL, or one of the best teams in the NFL, you just make the right plays. You just make all the good plays, and you just don't make too many mistakes. And that's what this Chiefs team does. To go along with Patrick Mahomes is one of the best, if not the best head coaches in the NFL, one of the best play designers, the most creative offensive mind. He knows how to manipulate defenses. And I think alongside him, he has a great host of coordinators that aren't really going anywhere. It's one of the weirder teams that has so much continuity in their coaching staff, despite the fact that they've been so successful and have just been able to replicate success every single year. You look at the freaking Philadelphia Eagles, and over the course of the last 4 years, they've had new OCs and new DCs, it feels like every single year. And you look at Kansas City, and they haven't really had that same problem. They have really been able to keep their guys, and I find that quite interesting. I wonder if they're paying their guys quite nicely because they do a heck of a job just retaining their guys. All in all, with Mahomes and of course Kelsey and all the superstar talent they have, that offense and that defense is going to be great. And specifically, that coaching staff does a really nice job of getting this team to where they need to be. Let's go and talk about my third reason, and I'll make this one pretty quick. I want to talk about the stellar defense. Now, when you look at this defense on paper, it doesn't really have like the big shiny names. There's no Myles Garrett or Nick Bosa. There's no Micah Parsons on this team. But gosh dang it, man, it's the best defense, if not one of the best defenses in the NFL, and they have such a great coaching staff to work with. I do want to look at these statistics from the 2024 season. Obviously, last year, this is one of the best defenses out there. They ranked 6th in opponents' points per game, only allowing 20.5, 10th in opponents' yards per game, 8th in opponents' touchdowns per game, 11th in the red zone, 9th on 4th down. They were not the best on 3rd down, so that's definitely something they should probably work on. They were really solid against the run, 14th in opponent rush play percentage, 6th in opponents' yards per rush, 10th in opponents' rushing yards a game. And against the pass, there's definitely work to be done here, but it's definitely not horrendous by no means. 66.21 opponent completion percentage, that's 21st, 19th in opponents' yards per pass, and 15th in sack percentage, generally around middle of the pack in that category. And now when you look at this depth chart, there's just so much talent. And what I like about what they did this offseason is they added more variety. Again, something I talked about throughout this video, variety, depth, more options to work with. That's kind of what they did here. George Karlaftis is one of the best pass rushers. I think he had like 8 or 9 sacks last year. Charles Amenahu, you now bring in Ashton Gillott. We'll see what he can do. You have some different options now in the interior with Chris Jones, Jerry Tillery, Mike Pennell, and Omar Norman-Lott. I would like to see like one more capable body here, like maybe a bit more of an upgrade over Mike or Jerry, but I feel okay about that room. Mike Donna, you're really hoping that Felix Uzomo can really step up and play here. They have Jeffrey Bassa listed here, but he's not going to play off the edge unless they really fully transition him over there. We'll have to wait and see. Your starting linebackers, in my opinion, is the best linebacking core in the NFL. I don't think there's an argument for that. Cornerback-wise, I do think Christian Fulton's a nice little player here that can definitely play opposite of Trent McDuffie. Would like to see maybe a bit more of an upgrade over Christian Fulton in the future because I think this defense could really use a secondary boost, but I feel pretty good about it. Trent McDuffie, Jalen Watson, Jaden Hicks now steps in at that strong safety role. Brian Cook, Mike Edwards, Christian Fulton, Noah Williams, Joshua Williams there too. Chamari Connor, and a handful of other guys. With this defensive coordinating room, with this defensive talent, this is one of the better units out there. I did think last year they really struggled with the variety, with the depth. They didn't really have so much depth on this roster. They had the starters, but when Chris Jones was gassed, they didn't really have anybody out there that can get to the quarterback consistently. And I think now there is some of that depth. Now, I think there's certain guys that need to step up, like a Felix Uzoma, and they're going to probably need a lot from Charles Amenahu just to stay healthy, and Omar Norman-Lott needs to step up as a pass rusher in day one. But for the most part, I feel really confident about this defense. Like, this is yet again probably going to end up being a top 10 defense, if not top 5, like they kind of were last year. And when you have Mahomes on the other side, when you have Andy Reid on the other side, you just need this defense to be as dang good as possible, and I think that's what they have. When you look around the NFL, there's only a handful of teams that fully can say they have a top 10 level offense and a top 10 level defense, and I think Kansas City is one of them. The last thing I want to say before we move on to my final little thoughts here, when you look around the landscape of the NFL, there's a lot of teams that got quite worse this offseason. Hell, just look at the Philadelphia Eagles, who in my opinion are still one of the best teams in the NFL. There's no doubt about that, but they lost a handful of guys too, just like Kansas City. In fact, I kind of think that they lost a lot more than Kansas City. Josh Sweat, Milton Williams, they lost their right guard, who I'm blanking on his name, Mekhi Becton. They lost a handful of players, and as long as they have Saquon, Hurts, AJ, those guys in the defense, they're going to be fine. But they lost quite a bit. They also lost their offensive coordinator too, so there are a lot of changes over there. Detroit lose their OC, DC, their starting center. Aiden Hutchinson's coming back from a broken freaking leg. I do think the Ravens are still a damn good team that didn't really lose much. Same with Buffalo, but if you're Kansas City, you feel pretty confident because you've beaten those teams consistently in the playoffs. So I kind of think Kansas City has to be one of those teams that you have to say is the favorite in the AFC. And if they can get all the way to the AFC, I think you got to feel pretty confident about whoever they go up against in the NFC, even if it is that Philadelphia Eagles team, because how did Philadelphia beat you? With their pass rushers. Well, this year they lose out on Josh Sweat. They don't have a Milton Williams, and they're relying on a whole bunch of guys who a little bit of some question marks to their game. So if I am a Kansas City fan, I am feeling very confident. My final thoughts on this team, it's one of the best teams in the NFL. In general, I think the surrounding NFC and AFC teams have gotten slightly worse, if not maybe slightly better in some regards, but ones that are serious contenders, I think that if I'm a Kansas City Chiefs fan, I feel really confident that we can still beat those teams and get back on top of the NFL. I think as of today, they're easily one of, if not my favorite to win it all. But you guys let me know in the comment section below, how many games is Kansas City winning next year, and will they win another Super Bowl to add to the legacy of Mahomes and Andy Reid? Let me know down below. And if you enjoyed, hit the like and subscribe button. Love you guys. Peace.